Okay, let's get to today's program. Award-winning nationally published journalist Daniel P. Smith left his second career as a high school English teacher in 2004 to pursue the writing life. Less than 5 months removed from the classroom and 23 years old, Smith teamed with Chicago-based Lake Claremont Press to write On the Job, Behind the Stars of the Chicago Police Department. His first book, and one inspired by his roots in a Chicago police family. He's a graduate of the University of Illinois, where he was an accomplished track and field athlete. So with you, please welcome Danny Smith.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate it. So in the interest of time, I'll dive right in, folks, okay? In 1977, a woman by the name of Karen Canzoneri was a single mom. She had a 6-year-old son. She was living on the west side of Chicago. She had just moved into an apartment there in the Austin neighborhood on Wabansie Avenue. She lived on the top floor with her 6-year-old son. She had been there just a couple weeks. The day was December 22nd, 1977, right before the Christmas holiday. And she is out running errands with her son. And she runs into a former coworker and more of an acquaintance. And she says, "Hey, I just moved into the neighborhood. Why don't you come by later? We'll catch up and, get to know each other again." And later in that night, that woman comes to Karen's apartment with her boyfriend and another couple. And they have, a little holiday revelry. And then everyone leaves. And Karen goes to sleep in one room of the apartment while her 6-year-old son, Tony, goes to sleep in another bedroom of the apartment. In the middle of the night, one of those dinner guests returns. His name is George Delvecchio. George Delvecchio goes into the apartment. He holds he holds Karen Canzoneri against her will and sexually assaults her. Karen pleads with him, "Please let me go to the washroom. Please let me go to the washroom." But George Delvecchio denies those requests. But Karen stays persistent. "Please let me go to the washroom." And eventually, George Delvecchio relents and he says, "Sure, you can go to the washroom." So Karen stands up from the bed. She walks out of the bedroom. And she actually goes out of her apartment and out of the building. And she goes on one of the few neighbors she knows here. She's brand new in the neighborhood. One of the few neighbors she knows. She bangs on the door. She says, "Call the police." The police immediately respond to the scene. My father is one of those responding officers there on the night, early morning hours of December 23rd, 1977. Immediately for the officers responding to that call, they have two questions. One, where's George Delvecchio? We can't find him. But two, and far more importantly, where is the 6-year-old boy? We can't find him. And that is immediately where the officer's attention goes, and they kind of disperse and start looking for the 6-year-old boy or George Delvecchio. My father, who had been on the job in Chicago as a police officer about 4 years at this time. Now, my father was no stranger to blood and gore and nasty things in life. He was one of 15 kids in a very transient and abusive household that was always kind of bouncing around. My father had been a drill sergeant in the Army, had served on the front lines of Vietnam. By the time he is called to this Karen Canzoneri's 911 call, he's been an officer in the Austin district on the west side for 4 years. A very high crime area of Chicago then, as it is unfortunately remains today. So my father had seen blood and gore and nasty things in life. This was kind of nothing new to him. But my father goes into the basement of this 3-flat on the west side there, and he sees an enclosed stairwell. And he looks inside that stairwell and he sees a Charlie Brown blanket. And he pulls out that blanket and he sees a 6-year-old boy's body. Now, my mother would always tell me, that was the beginning of the end for your father. He was never the same after that. My father started hitting the bottle harder and harder and became a pretty brutal alcoholic. He wanted to leave the police department. And this life that he was building up with my mother at that time, I had a 6-year-old brother named Bobby, a 4-year-old sister named Michelle. I was not yet around. I'd come around years later. But this life that they were building up together, saving for a home, saving for the future, plotting next steps in life, that went to the wayside. My father became very selfish in his aims and a lot of self-destructive behavior. And his downward spiral continued. In 1980, I come along. My mother would call me her little angel. Really, I'm the mistake. That's okay. I'm okay with that. But even my smiling little face couldn't change my father's kind of, his path. And so he kept spiraling downward and downward. In 1982, my folks separate. In 1983, they divorce. My father soon after leaves the Chicago Police Department. and he moves to Connecticut. One thing about child support laws is that they're different from state to state, so that was his way of skirting his responsibility. Growing up, I didn't have a relationship with my father that so many of my buddies around me did, right? Like I never played catch with my dad. He came to one little league game. I would send him my report card in the mail. I would talk with him on the phone maybe every week or so. But I didn't have any kind of paternal relationship at all. And from where I stand today, as the father of 2 kids myself, I haven't spoken to my father since I was 15 years old. I have no relationship with him. And, I have 2 young kids right now, 11 and 9, and they don't have a relationship with their grandfather and will never have a relationship with their grandfather. And, my mom always said to me, your father was never the same after he found that little boy. He'd wake up in the middle with the nightmares. He just was never the same. And so I started to see, I always knew this growing up, and I started to see how, like, being a police officer, whether you're in Chicago or Des Moines, Iowa, you see nasty things and you see things that really impact you and affect you. And so I was really curious about how do officers balance work and life? And how does the job shape and change who they are? And so I really kind of wanted to get at that. And I really wanted to try to understand it. So I was always kind of curious about that because I'm an Irish Catholic kid from Chicago, right? Like I had 2 options in life, cop or an electrician. We were not smart enough in my family to be firemen, okay? So like it was that, and I didn't have the priesthood in my future. So it was cop or electrician for me. And I scared the hell out of my Irish Catholic mother when I told her I'm going to be a writer, right? But as I always kind of was curious about this case that my father had, again, 3 years before I'm ever born, because I knew that event that happened in 1977 had a very profound impact on the trajectory of my life and subsequently those around me, okay? And so fast forward to 2000, and my brother, who's 8 years older than me, and in the absence of my father, he was that paternal figure for me. And my brother got in the police department when I was a sophomore in high school. So I'm, 15 years old. And my brother said to me, Danny, I can't wait to take you on a ride along. And when I turned 18 and I was finally able to go on a ride along, he said, hey, Danny, when are you going on a ride along with me? When are you going on a ride along with me? And I kind of held it off about as long as I could. But in June of 2000, I was a pretty naive, idealistic college student, 19 years old. And I said, all right, Bobby, I'll go on a ride along with you. And at this stage, my brother is working in the 25th district. So if any of you are familiar, I'm working with Chicago folks here. I just spoke in Alabama about this, and they have no clue what I'm talking about. But so the 25th district, Hanson Stadium, Brickyard Mall, it's based at Grandin Central. So for those of you familiar with, so the 25th district is one of Chicago's largest police district and among its most diverse. I mean, it has every color of humanity. So on the west side of the district is Galewood, where former Governor Quinn lives. A lot of mobsters have lived through the years too. You go on the east side of the district, you're dealing with like West Humboldt Park, heavily Puerto Rican area. But the 25th district is massive, has every color of humanity, every socioeconomic class, extremely diverse. It's a great place to learn how to be a police officer because you're dealing with everyone and everything, right? At this time in my brother's career, he's on a tactical unit. So he's still a patrol officer, but he's in plain clothes and he's in a plain car. The advantage to that is you get to be a freelancer in the district. So you hear all the calls come in for emergency service and you go where you feel your services are most needed. So subsequently, you're not going to the cat in the tree call, right? Like you're going to some of the more intense calls because they need extra police presence. You're also doing a lot of proactive policing as well. So my brother's working the 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. shift here on this weeknight in June, and I'm his ride along for the day. And we get out of the station at 6 o'clock, and there's already a litany of calls that we could, respond to, but there's nothing that my brother and his partner Dave feel demands their immediate attention. And so they go to a convenience store and they get their supplies for the night, which at that point in my brother's life was bottled water and chewing tobacco. He since has gotten a little healthier, which is good to see. But at 6:15, the first call comes out that demands our attention. A 17-year-old has shot his stepfather in the mouth, execution style. Now, my brother turns around to me and says, hey, Danny, do you want to go see the dead body? Now, I'm a pretty sensitive dude. If I never see a dead body outside of a funeral home, I'm okay with that, right? But I don't want to let big brother down. So I say, sure, let's go. And we put a light on the car. and we're going 60 miles an hour down Fullerton Avenue. And we pull in the front of a house on Narragansett Street, which for those of you familiar with the Northwest Side, that's a busy street up there, okay? This home is down the block from the Jewel where we did all our grocery shopping. It's less than 2 miles away from the house I grew up in. It's down the block from the Jewel where we did all our grocery shopping. It's kitty corner from Reese Park where I played baseball as a kid, right? It's a home I'd been by in my life 500 times easily. I'd been by on my bicycle with my buddies. I'd walked by it. I'd been by in the car with my mom, and it just blended in like any other home there. And, you know, we get there and there's already a pretty heavy police presence there. And my brother goes to the sergeant running the scene. He says, "Hey, Sarge, my brother's with me. He's a ride along. Can you see the dead body?" And it's Chicago. So they say, "Sure, what the hell?" And so I get to see my first dead body outside of a funeral home. Now, I don't know how I'm going to react. Am I going to throw up? Am I going to get queasy? I have no clue, right? And if we can kind of, so I'll place it. It's the basement of a ranch home. And it's an open basement with a bedroom off to the side. So let's pretend the podium is the door to the bedroom. And that's where the dead guy is. And he's staring up at the ceiling, just laying on the bed like that, right? And I don't get much closer than this. And I look in, and not knowing what my reaction was going to be, I was surprised by what it was, which was complete and utter indifference. That to me looked like a wax museum figure. Okay. It looked like some kind of stage curated scene. There's all this activity out in the main area of the basement, right? There's police officers talking to one another. There's police officers taking photos, taking notes. Like there's action, there's movement. It's quiet and somber, but there's still movement and talk and conversation. But in this bedroom, there's just a dead guy staring at a ceiling, right? And I remember the TV was on, and it was The Simpsons. And I couldn't, in my own mind, say 10 minutes ago, this guy was alive. Like he was watching Homer and Bart and Lisa and Maggie, like The Simpsons. I couldn't connect that in my own mind. I really struggled to see that that was a real situation, right? This guy was alive. I couldn't do it. It looked so artificial. And I scan across the room, and again, I'm watching police officers taking notes, talking to one another, and I just see all this action. I'm looking at faces, and I get all the way to my left, and kind of where the piano is. And there's a Chicago police officer, a detective, and he's in a full suit, and there's a woman in front of him sitting on a couch. And this officer's down like this, and he has his hands on her knees. And I could see him kind of rubbing her knees and trying to talk to her and calm her down. Now, this woman, I should say this guy who was dead in there, I can't remember if he was wearing shorts or pants or he had long hair, short hair. That has never really resonated with me and stuck with me. But this woman, I remember exactly what she was wearing. She was wearing a white shirt and white pants, and they were completely covered in blood. Now, that made that situation real for me. Not only was that her husband in there who was dead, do you know who did the murder? Her own son. So in the matter of 10 minutes, right, this woman has not only lost her husband, but any hopes or aspirations she has for her son, those are gone, right? We have a pretty interesting, I'll call it, criminal justice system here in Cook County. It tends to not look well on executed hits, though. Right? Like that is something that'll be penalized. And so if we find this 17-year-old, he's going to go away for a long time. And I'm captivated by this woman. I just stare at her, and I cannot take my eyes off her. She just rocks back and forth. She has her head over her face and just rocks back and forth. And this detective is trying to get her to say anything and trying to calm her down and get any information out of her. And she just keeps rocking back and forth with her hands over her head, covered in blood. And I'm wondering, does she need someone to go over there and give her a hug or to pray with her? What's going through her mind? And you know, what led to this, right? I'm wondering all these questions, and I'm captivated by this woman. While I'm staring at this woman for 5 minutes, though, captivated by her, every other police officer in that scene, including my brother, is doing something else. Their mind is elsewhere. Where's the 17-year-old with a gun who's already killed one person, and we don't know what else he's capable of, right? That's where their attention is. So after about 5 minutes of staring at this woman, I feel a tap on my shoulder. It's my brother, and he says, "Danny, let's go." And we go out into the car, and I slide into the back seat, and I have this ability as a ride-along, because I'm not on duty, so to speak, right? I'm just kind of there for the show. And I'm able to kind of detach from that situation or I should say process it and put it into some kind of perspective or context. But my brother didn't have that luxury, right? He found out in that time that I'm staring at this woman, he found out who the boy's girl, who the 17-year-old's girlfriend was, who his buddies were, what kind of car he drives. And we spend the next 2 hours flying around the Northwest side looking for this kid. Never find him. And he's never been found. But we spend the next 2 hours. That's what we do. We're going from stop, and the night just keeps going. This whole 8-hour shift, we're going one to the next to the next. It just keeps another, luckily not another murder that night, but it was just nonstop action. And I remember I got home to my college apartment that night, and it was about 3 a.m. And I lived at that point on Taylor Street in Little Italy. And I remember I'm the kind of guy who, when my head hits the pillow at 3 a.m., I'm out, right? And I just remember staring at the ceiling, and this woman kept coming back into my mind. Had she changed her clothes? Had she heard from her son? And I'm just, again, still captivated by this woman. But slowly my thoughts started to drift to something else, which was, what was my brother doing at that moment? Right? I was able to sit in the back seat of that car and to put things into perspective and context and try to wrap my head around what I just seen, right? But my brother never had that luxury because he was on duty and he had to figure out where the 17-year-old gun was. But he just saw something pretty gruesome, had to slide it in his back pocket because he had something to do. And so I really started to understand, again, this goes back to this idea. How does the job shape and change who officers are? How does it change their relationship with others? How does it change their feelings about life and their fellow humans? How does it change their outlook and perspective on life? Because the reality about being a police officer is that you rarely see anyone in their finest hour, right? Like none of us want to see the police officer, right? Because it either means we're the victim of something or something bad has happened, right? Like that's not a good feeling, right? Well, everyone's happy to see the fireman, right? The fireman's there to save the day. But no one wants to see police, right? Like even the most, I assume none of us have warrants for felonies here. You know, even when we're driving down the expressway and we see lights go on behind us, we're the nice people. And we think, what does this jerk want? And we're the nice people, right? Like we don't have warrants for our arrest and bad things, right, in our history. So it's a really interesting thing. So you're never called anyone's finest hour. You see people victimized all the time. You see gruesome, nasty things. How does that shape and change who you are? And so to do that, I went about writing this book where I interviewed over 100 officers, and I profile 19 in the book, but I try to understand, how do they balance work and life? How does the job shape and change who they are? Specifically in Chicago, against that backdrop of Chicago. And I'll make the argument, what we have in Chicago, and I'll show you this in a moment, we have a volume of crime in Chicago, okay? And it's intense volume of crime. But if you go to Des Moines, Iowa, or name your community in America, those officers see nasty things done to kids. They see gruesome car accidents. You know, they see things that impact their soul, right? And so the volume is different in Chicago, but the intensity is no less different. So I use Chicago as a backdrop, but really I think there's similarities with everything. So I'm going to skip through some things, but I'm going to introduce you to two officers I profile in the book. I'll skip through some things, but before I do that, I'm going to just kind of give you, well, I went too far. But anyway, I always joke, Chicago has a different, I'm going to take a sidebar here, but Chicago has a different relationship with crime than really any other major American city, okay? Let me illustrate it this way. Who knows where Jimmy Hoff is buried? If any of you know, I have some people who want to talk to you, okay? No one knows, right? It's one of the great American crime mysteries. Where is Jimmy Hoffa? No one has any clue, right? There's all these theories that he's in the end zone of the football stadium, that he's in the East River. There's all these theories. We have no clue where he is. None, right? Theories, never found him, right? No clue. All right. Who knows? Has anybody heard of the Spilatro brothers? Spilatro brothers, right? So Spilatro brothers, if you've ever seen them, the movie Casino is loosely based on the Spilatro brothers. The Spilatro brothers were two kids from Chicago, and as Vegas is coming up as a place where organized crime can make a lot of money, the Chicago mob leaders send the Spilatro brothers to Vegas and say, hey, you run our office in Vegas, right? The problem is that the Spilatro brothers are nuts, okay? And the Spilatro brothers don't like playing by anyone's rules, and so they get into some hot water in Vegas. The Chicago mob leaders bring them back, They kill them, right? Some of you probably remember this pretty famous story in Chicago. They kill them and then they bury them. Anybody remember where they buried the Spilotro brothers? Yes, sir. Indiana, even more specifically. A cornfield, even more specifically. Farm, cornfield. Anybody know what route it was on? What street? Route 41. Right? You guys know Route 41 up here. In Chicago, it's Lakeshore Drive, right? Well, whatever the hell it's called now. In Northwest Indiana, Route 41 is a well-trafficked, busy road. The Spilotro brothers were buried in a shallow grave in a cornfield in Northwest Indiana, and they were found pretty quickly. If we were not meant to find the Spilotro brothers, we would not find the Spilotro brothers. But that's not how Chicago works. For better or worse, for right or wrong, Chicago has a much different relationship with crime than I would argue any other major American city. And as in researching this book, I would go back and I would find that there were public hangings in Chicago in the 1800s, and they would bring out thousands and thousands of people. We're a pretty morbid place sometimes, I think, but it is what it is. And that's kind of just what Chicago is. So I always pointed out this way, St. Valentine's Day Massacre, right? Capone's coming up as a crime leader in Chicago, and he says he's running the South Side, but he wants to take over the entire city. So he he goes into Bugs, he sends his guys into Bugs Moran's gang on Clark Street on the Northwest Side, right? And then they go in, Capone's guys, that is, they go into that garage dressed as police officers and identify themselves as police officers. They put Bugs Moran's gang against the wall and they kill them. This is the front page of the Chicago Tribune the next morning, right? The message was sent, right? Like, again, for right or wrong, this is kind of Chicago's criminal landscape. It operates a little differently than some others, right? And so that's the kind of the backdrop that I think Chicago's officers work with. So this has changed a little bit. So my book came out in 2008. We've had a few different superintendents then and a few different mayors since then. So things have changed a little bit. But when I wrote the book in 2008, this is what Chicago's police district looked like. I'm going to show you what one night looks like for a Chicago police officer, okay? So all of Chicago here. Here's the 25th district I talked about earlier there on the north, kind of the northwest side, right? To put in perspective, this is downtown, 1st district. Okay. So I went to the Office of Emergency Management. This is our 911 call center. And I said, hey, I would like all the calls for emergency service in the 11th district from 4 p.m. to midnight. I said, let's do last Saturday. The day was June 3rd, 2006. Okay. Now, the 11th district is on the west side of Chicago, just west of the United Center. Okay. So downtown here, here's the 11th district. So straight west of downtown, right? The 11th district, one of Chicago's most high crime, poverty ridden. It's a tough area. Okay. So I know when I ask the Office of Emergency Management for, hey, show me 4 p.m. to midnight, all the calls in the 11th district on a Saturday night in June, I have a good sense it's going to be pretty active. Okay. All right. So let's see what it's like. Because I want to give you a sense in black and white terms what Chicago police officers are up against. So this is June 3rd, 2006. So let's run through this. This is the first page of the 911 call report, 11th district only, 4 p.m. to midnight. So we'll start at line 1 here. It's 403, the first call comes in. Everything gets an event number. That's what this is. There's an acronym for what did officers have to respond to. Was it an assault in progress, a domestic disturbance, a car accident, arson? Yeah. What do they have to respond to? You have the address of the occurrence and the location of the service. And then you have the beat car assigned to it, right? The patrol car assigned to it, okay? So this is 4 p.m. to midnight. Let's see what 4 p.m. to midnight looks like in the 11th. This is page 1. This is page 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Let's call it 16 and a third. Okay. This is one police district. Chicago had 24 others. Okay. This is the last 11 minutes. Okay. Shots fired at 11:49, followed by a foot pursuit. Gambling disturbance, sex offense. That's the last 11 minutes. Interestingly enough, think of this. This is car 1121. So that's patrol car 1121, 2 officers. They are assigned to the shots fired call at 11:49 that's followed by a foot pursuit. 10 minutes later, car 1121 is dispatched to a sex offense. I want you to think about what a shots fired call followed by a foot pursuit, like what that would maybe look like, how that is an adrenaline-filled, scary thing, right? That is like nonstop action. A sex offense is the complete opposite. It is a situation that calls for a tremendous amount of decorum and patience, right? So in 10 minutes, think of the hats those officers had to wear, that they had to switch from a foot pursuit after shots fired call to a sex offense. That's a lot to ask of just human beings in general, right? So I think what fascinated me about this, I went through the process of these 17 pages, right? And I had them on my desk, and I had a computer screen open, and I went through line by line, and I took the most serious calls, the ones that would demand a little bit more attention, and I recreated them in the book. And I just wrote time, nature of the call, time, nature of the call, time, nature of the call, just on my Word document. And this is what it looks like in the book, or a sample of it at least. It fills up a whole page in the book. So I would write 753, assault in progress, 753, battery, 758, disturbance. But it's a very tedious process of going through each of these lines on the 17 pages, writing time and nature of the call. And what I started to see was 2 trends emerged. One was the sheer diversity of crime that happened on this one evening. There are numerous shots fired calls. There's domestics, there's arson, there's auto accidents, there's assaults. Just about, in a very generic sense, just about every type of crime that could happen did happen in this one 8-hour shift. Now, mind you, I didn't go to the Chicago Police 911 call center and say, hey, give me the wildest night in the history of Chicago. All I said was, let's do last Saturday, right? The other trend that emerged for me as I go about writing time, nature of the call, time, nature of the call. The biggest gap in the entire 8-hour shift, the biggest gap between 911 service is 7 minutes, okay? So it's a very interesting thing to me. Like, I went into this project, by the time I get this data, I'm about 2/3 of the way through my interviews of these over 100 officers I chatted with, right? So I'm going into this project asking really big questions. How do officers balance work and life? How does the job shape and change who they are? When I see this data, though, and that the biggest gap from 911 calls from the entire 8-hour shift is 7 minutes, my mind goes somewhere else. Where does the officer find the time to eat? Where does the officer find the time to go to the bathroom, right? Like, thank God Chicago has alleys. Where does the officer find the time to call home to see if Junior's feeling better? Like, just basic life functions. One of the safest places in Chicago, and I'm not joking here, okay? One of the safest places in Chicago is Pompey Bakery on Taylor Street at 6 p.m. Okay? Because the 12th District Station gets out roll call at 6 p.m. and all those officers a lot of them go to Pompey Bakery to eat at 6 p.m. because they know if they don't eat then, they might not eat the rest of the night. I think about these basic life choices we have, right? And how officers see the world through a little bit of a different lens, right? Basic life choice. You and I go into a restaurant, right? We think, what's the soup of the day? What's the special? What do you have on tap, right? An officer, as I went about writing this book, I interviewed, as I said, over 100 officers. Now, about 1/3 of those I met at their homes. About 1/3 of those I did ride-alongs with. And about 1/3 of them I met at restaurants. And all officers picked where he or she wanted to meet. I would always kind of defer to what they felt comfortable doing. For the officers that met at restaurants, I would always conduct my own sociological experiment. I'd get there early. I'd meet them outside or in the lobby. And then we'd be ushered to our table. I would always let the officer pick where he or she wanted to sit. 100% of the time, it was the same place, facing the door. Okay? Again, I think average Joes, we walk into a restaurant, what's on tap? What's the soup of the day? What's the special? officers see the world through a little bit of a different lens. Even the most basic life decision about like, I'm going to sit down and have a meal. Well, they got to sit a certain way, and they prefer to wait for a table rather than not have that seat facing the door. So it's a very kind of unique thing. So let me introduce you to some of the officers. I'm going to fire through some ones. So as I mentioned, I interviewed over 100 officers in writing this book. In all aspects, the 19 I profile in the book, I have specific chapters devoted to them. I try to focus on some aspect of their life and career. So I talked with the city's first female detective. I talked with someone who was an alcoholic, and how did the job contribute to that? I talked with someone who had to kill someone, right? Like Hollywood tells us Dirty Harry shoots the bad guy, walks into the sunset, life is good. But does it really work that way, right? So how did that particular officer kind of process what he had to do in having to kill someone? So two officers I'm going to talk about, and I thought this one would be really great for this crowd because this is the 1968 Democratic National Convention. I presume, I know I'm with a young crowd here, but I know some of you guys remember this event, or certainly have, I bet you there's some great firsthand stories here too, right? You can make the argument that this is the most impactful week in Chicago history. Certainly the most impactful year of 1968 in Chicago is a crazy year, right? Let's talk about 1968. The Vietnam War is raging on, and public opinion is churning about that. Martin Luther King is assassinated in the spring. Bobby Kennedy is killed in June. And remember, after King gets shot, what happened in Chicago? Didn't look very nice, right? Things happened, right? We have a very strong-willed mayor at that time, right? Daley the First. Everything comes to a head 1 week in Chicago in 1968, right? You think about this in the 68 convention, right? It's much different political times in the sense that now, historically, who knows what's happening in 2024, but historically, right? We think about the Republican or Democratic convention. We know who the candidate is heading into the convention, and it becomes more of a coronation. Whereas in 1968, we didn't know who the Democratic candidate was going to be, and there were very aggressive factions battling for who that candidate was going to be, right, and different viewpoints. And it's contentious on the floor of the convention, but it's contentious outside where we have a very counterculture movement going on, right? And we had months prior, Chicago go up in flames. Some Chicago neighborhoods go up in flames after King's assassination. And so Daley says, Mayor Daley says, maintain order, and kind of gives a green light for police to do what they need to do. And these are the scenes that are broadcast to the world, right? Police and protesters clashing on the street, okay? And so I wanted to meet someone who was at 1968 to get his perspective, the only male officers at that time, to get his perspective on what happened. Hey, what did you see? How did you think about things then? What do you think about them now? And I meet an officer by the name of John O'Shea. And John was a rookie officer in 1968, and he was stationed outside of the Conrad Hilton Hotel on Michigan Avenue. For those of you who know anything about Convention Week, that's kind of ground zero for a lot of this activity, right? So John was in the middle of the storm as a rookie officer. He saw it all. Hey, John, what did you see about? What did you see? What do you remember about it? How did you feel about things then? How do you feel about them now? I'm asking these questions to John. And then I asked John the same question I asked every single officer I chatted with. Tell me about a day that defines your career. Tell me about a day you'll just never forget about. Now, when I asked that question to John, this is why I'm not an attorney, I think John is going to give me another hour on the 1968 Democratic National Convention, right? Like he was at ground zero for this monumental civic event. Books have been written about 68 and August 68 in Chicago, documentaries. It is a big deal in Chicago history. But I asked John, tell me about a day that defines your career. And John looks at me and he says, Miracle Moon. I said, John, what's Miracle Moon? And he says, who? And I said, who what? And he says, who is Miracle Moon? And I said, okay, John, who is Miracle Moon? John was a patrol officer his entire life, but at the end of his career, he became a detective. And Miracle Moon was a little girl, she was 2 years old, that he encountered at the end of his police career as a detective. She died 3 times in 1 week. So follow me here. She lived in the 11th district on the west side, that area I showed you earlier. Miracle was being potty trained and was not doing very well with it. The mother's boyfriend gets frustrated by this as the little girl's crying and she soiled herself. The mother's boyfriend gets frustrated by this. He puts her in the tub and he drowns her. He pumps her back to life. She lives. A few days later, the exact same scene repeats itself. Miracle Moon has soiled herself. She's crying. The mother's boyfriend gets ticked off. He puts her in the tub, drowns her, pulls her out, tries to revive her again, but it doesn't work. The mother calls paramedics. They respond to the scene. And then they transfer the little girl to Bethany Hospital on the west side, small community hospital there on the west side. John, as the detective, is assigned this case pretty immediately because his sergeant says, John, something's off here. Why don't you go to Bethany Hospital and see what you can find out? So John reports to Bethany Hospital, where the medical team is working to revive this little girl, and they're successful in doing so. And John says, there's not a dry eye in the house. It is a triumphant moment that they brought this little girl back to life. She's transferred from Bethany Hospital to Loyola University Medical Center, much more well-resourced, larger hospital. There, a leading doctor of child abuse says that Miracle has suffered one of the most severe cases of bruising and abuse he's ever encountered. She ends up dying at Loyola University as a result of her injuries. So now John has a homicide investigation on his hands. From the get-go, the mother's boyfriend, signs are pointing to the mother's boyfriend, so that's the guy that they begin interrogating and asking questions to. Now, again, if we watch the cop movies on television, we see an officer interrogating a subject, and we see chairs flying across the room and cuss words being flown and threats being made. And John says, hey, there might be some guys that's in their toolbox, but that's not me. I want to be the nicest guy in the house. Right? I'm going to hand them the menu to the Italian deli and say, hey, what can I get you on a sandwich? Do you want mustard on that? Mayo, pickles, extra pickles? Do you want a drink? What do you want? I want to be the nicest guy in the house because if I'm trying to bully this guy or being abusive to him, he's not going to cooperate with me. I want to try to form some common ground with him because that helps me do my job. So John's asking the guy, the mother's boyfriend questions. What happened, and he's not giving up anything. But John keeps coming back to one line of questioning. He says, well, don't you want this little girl's life to be worth something? Don't you want it to mean something? And he keeps going to get to that point. Help me do my job. Help me figure out what happened here. We want this little girl's life to be worth something. And eventually, the mother's boyfriend gives a signed and videotaped confession of exactly what happened to it and exactly how he drowned her and how she did. And he was eventually prosecuted for that and pled guilty, in fact. So this, John is a vibrant character. John is 77 years old now. He lives down the block from me, so my property values have plummeted. But John is a guy of great energy. He is a true Chicago guy. If any of you ever heard the frame a D's and Do's guys, Mike Royko used to say that, that's John. He is a Chicago neighborhood guy through and through. John is so energetic, so lively, that the day he retired from the Chicago Police Department at age 56, after 30-some years in the police department, he went into the Chicago Fire Academy and spent 7 years as a firefighter in Chicago. The reason John did that, though, was not only because he has a lot of energy and needs a place to put it, it's because he married late in life. And at the time that he's investigating Miracle Moon's death, he has his own 2-year-old girl at home, and his wife has just given birth to triplet boys. Okay. So I only know John to be energetic and vivacious, except for this when he's telling me about Miracle Moon. For the first time, O'Shea's voice falls in vitality. For the first time, his eyes aim downward and the table anchors his hands. His speech slows and he stammers over words. Miracle Moon's physical presence removed, her spirit resonates at a Northwest Side diner on a snowy January morning. It consumes the man who saw murder and drugs, violence and revolt, yet distanced himself from those episodes. But Miracle Moon, John O'Shea, cannot forget. O'Shea starts, many guys go through their careers doing things, but not many say this is why I'm on the force. If this didn't happen, if I never met Miracle, then I wouldn't have much more to say than I did my job and I did it right. But I felt I championed this innocence. I made her life worth something. She's with me every day of my life. Nobody had defended her existence, but I did. You can laugh at everything out there because it's possible to see the humor in tragedy. It all encompasses life. A lot of us are victims, but Miracle's story cannot be put into the life sucks category. No copper can ever laugh at the death of a child. She should have been a thing of beauty, he says. She should have been somebody's princess. I highlighted a line in John's previous slide. She's with me every day of my life. So I mentioned as John's investigating this case, he has his own 2-year-old girl at home, same age as Miracle, and he's triplet boys. If you think about the scene of Miracle's death, the bathtub plays a pretty integral part in her story, right? John says every time he puts his kids in the bathtub, he thinks about Miracle Moon. Now, Gracie's now 26 years old and the boys are 24. But every time, I have young kids, right? And I imagine so many of you had young kids or grandkids, right? Like, how many baths do you give to kids when they're young, right? So with John as a 2-year-old and triplet boys, how many baths was he giving in his own household? And Miracle Moon's memory and presence and spirit was kind of moving through him at that moment, because he said, every time I give my kids a bath, I think about that girl, right? It's a lot of bathtubs for 4 kids. That's John O'Shea about a month before he retires, working as a fireman. And as I said, so John retired from the police department, the fire department, I should say, at 63. Chicago is mandatory retirement for police and fire. 63, you're out. So John forced out at 63. He moved to Arizona with the family when they were younger in elementary school, the kids were. And then, hey, this is great, but it's not for me. He moved back to Chicago, and now he lives around the corner from me. And that's why my property values have plummeted. So, but John's a great character. And what I love about John's story, and he's the officer, from those who've read the book, he's the one I get asked about the most, because John's story, right? You think it's going to be about 1968. This event we all know of, we've heard of, books, movies been made of, right? But when you ask him about a day that defines his career, he doesn't talk about that. He talks about a 2-year-old girl none of us have ever heard of, who the newspapers didn't even waste ink on, but he made a very courageous decision to kind of share how important her story was and kind of give life and voice to her life. And I thought that was pretty important. So I'm going to end here before we get on to Q&A with one more officer. I'm an Irish Catholic kid from Chicago, 12 years of Catholic school in me. I consider myself a pretty spiritual guy. And I wanted to meet someone like, how do you believe in God seeing what you do, right? Whether it's God or Yahweh or Buddha, some kind of higher power in the world that wants good. Like, how do you believe in that when all you do is see nasty stuff done to other people, right? And that was very curious to me. And so I meet a guy by the name of Mike Cummins. Now, Mike is, and I don't say this lightly, is the most fascinating dude I've ever met in my life. I've had the privilege of I've been a journalist for over 20 years. I've interviewed CEOs and change makers and innovators, and Mike is still the most fascinating man I've ever met in my life. He has undergraduate and graduate degrees in religious studies. He is not a native Chicagoan. Mike was from an Air Force family, so he was always bouncing around. And the reason he ends up in Chicago is because he's teaching religion at a Catholic high school. And he ends up teaching at St. Ignatius, arguably Chicago's premier Catholic high school, right? I didn't go there, but that's besides the point. So John's teaching at St. Ignatius, but Mike is teaching at St. Ignatius, teaching religion, happy with life, feeling good. He does not own a car. He does not own a TV, because Mike is a reader. He's a thinker. He's a philosopher, extremely well-read. But not being native to Chicago, Mike is also very ignorant to the Chicago way. Like, when Mike comes to Chicago, he does not know what a gangway is, right? Like, Mike puts ketchup on a hot dog. Mike would see a drug deal happening at the end of his block, and he'd say, that's nice, those 2 guys are shaking hands. Mike would see graffiti on a viaduct and say, oh, that's a nice art project done by disadvantaged youth. Like, he was ignorant, right? But the reason he took the Chicago police test, and he always wanted to be a police officer, because he loved reading detective comic books as a kid. Now, nothing is as unlike being a Chicago police officer as Dick Tracy, but that was his very naive thought, right? But then he gets on the police department in Chicago, leaves teaching religion at Catholic high schools, becomes a police officer in Chicago. At the time I interview Mike, he's a sex crimes detective. They see some of the nastiest stuff. And that is a brutish job, right? And so Mike is a sex crime detective. I'm interviewing Mike at the Gale Street Inn on Milwaukee Avenue, great rib place. Mike's facing the door. And I say, Mike, how do you believe in God seeing what you do? Mike is a guy who had given serious consideration to join the priesthood. Okay. And again, very thoughtful dude. How do you believe in God seeing what you do? As a police officer, Cummins realizes the penchant for crime to extend its reach, the ability of violence to halt humanity's pulse. He points to the story of Adam and Eve as one that runs parallel with his police work. Once Adam and Eve ate from that tree of knowledge, their eyes opened up, he says. Prior to that, they were innocent, happy, blissful. But once they gave into that temptation, they saw corruption and betrayal. And then Mike looked me in the eye and he said to me the most chilling and poetic line I've ever heard in my life. Like them, my eyes have been opened and I cannot shut them. Mike went on to talk, Mike comes here and he's ignorant to crime and violence on his own block, let alone the greater city of Chicago, right? He has no clue. He's kind of in his own little bubble. But when he becomes a police officer, he's forced to confront all this. And what he goes on to talk about is how that actually enhanced his faith, because he thought, well, I can bring some peace to these people, at least for a moment, at least for an evening. I could let them know this victim, let them know someone cares and is trying to help them and is working for them. That enhances my faith. And he talked about how his faith actually enhanced his police work. I've had the great privilege of giving this talk over 100 venues across 9 states now. And I always appreciate the audience who lets me kind of have at it. And I hope your eyes have been opened up a little bit as well. So with that, we'll go to about 10, 12 minutes of Q&A. If you guys have any questions, I will answer them as honestly and sincerely as I can, as long as they're not about our new mayor. Yes. I joke. Yes, miss. I'm just joking. You don't want my opinion on the mayor anyway. I don't study that.
I'm going to give you a really tough question. So since 2006, in what ways has the Chicago police staff's job gotten worse? And have there been any attempts to make it easier for them to deal with what happened, whether or not it got better or worse? Because this is my opinion, that it's very traumatic to be a Chicago police officer, and perhaps we should make it easier for them to deal with this trauma, or give them a desk job if they feel they can't handle the trauma anymore, but still keep their salary.
Yeah. So there's a few kind of layered questions in there. So I wrote the book in 2008. It was published in 2008, I should say. I started my research in 2004. I would argue it's a much different time for American policing in 2004 versus today. That's just not true of Chicago. I would argue that's anywhere. The camera phone. I think we don't. How many of you, when you were growing up, the police officer was kind of a friend? Find me a 12-year-old youth today that thinks that. I mean, your grandkids might, but like in some of these areas of Chicago, that is not true. That is what a cultural shift, right? I would argue white kids too, and Hispanic kids, But yeah, certainly in the African-American community, I think you can make a very strong argument of that, right? Yeah. So I think it's a tough job to be a police officer today. I think they're constantly second guessed. The professionalism of it has changed quite a bit. For those of you who like kids my age, I'm 42, or those a little bit older than me, so the Gen Xers of the world. If you went to if you took the Chicago Police Department test, it was held like once every 3 years, and you have 20,000 people show up on that one day. Now there's like rotating tests because they can't get people. Yeah, so there isn't interest in being the job, and I think it's a very tough job. You can get killed, first of all. You can get indicted. You can lose a lot of things, right? And so I think that makes it pretty tough to kind of recruit qualified candidates, and so that makes it tough. You hit on something else that I'd like to talk about, which was trauma, right? Like officers see nasty things, right? So in this book, I do interview a guy by the name of Rory Gilbert. Rory ran a nonprofit called St. Michael's House. And what that was a counseling center right by the United Center. And it was a counseling center for officers from throughout the Chicagoland area where they could go independent of the police department, because the police department in Chicago has its own like health, mental health, physical health agency, its own police assistance group, right? But but a lot of officers are reluctant to go to that, right? Because although it's supposed to be confidential, if word gets out that you can't handle your business, how many officers do you think want to ride with you? You know? And so a lot of officers kind of keep this kind of tucked in. I would argue that that's a very dangerous thing. So I love St. Michael's House. Unfortunately, it's since closed. I am a proponent for officers having some kind of positive outlet for what they encounter, right? Like you encounter nasty things and it's a stressful job. So my brother who retired about a year ago, my brother was a chronic workout guy, always worked out. Some have humor, right? Like that's their coping mechanism. 50. You're seeing that happen a lot in Chicago Police Department. A lot of young retirements. Because at 50, you could start drawing on your pension. I'm not a pension expert here in Chicago, but you can retire at 50. A lot of coppers are retiring early, especially if they have a spouse or a significant other who can carry some health insurance for a while and has some income coming in. But 50 is young enough where I can kind of change careers and I can get a job elsewhere too. So that's happening a lot. My brother's not alone as a 50-year-old retired police officer. Now he had 27 years, so he kind of did his time too. But yeah, so I'm a proponent of having some kind of positive outlet, which I think there's been efforts, especially recently, police officer suicide. This has long been a dark secret of police departments across the country, the number of police officer suicides. In the book, I cite a stat, again, outdated stat, admittedly, because the book was researched in the early 2000s, but police officers in Chicago committed suicide at 5 times the rate of Chicago's other citizens. I mean, that's a troubling statistic. So how do we kind of combat that? It's very, very similar to military and dentist, I understand too, is what I understand. But yeah, so you're exactly right. No, seriously. I'm dead serious. Dentists have one of the highest suicide rates in the country. So any dentists in here? I hope I'm not right about that, but yeah. So yeah, so in short, I think there's efforts to make it more counseling, more engagement, that officers can feel better about their work and more engaged in their work. But I think it's becoming harder and harder to do with such criticism constantly being hurled at them. And I think there's a lack of engagement with the work that makes it, frankly, as someone who lives in Chicago and has 2 young kids in Chicago, kind of scares me sometimes. So yes, sir.
Yes, I've had a lot of experience with police all my life. One of the things is, I know this is not going to be popular with everyone here,
It's okay.
but being a police officer does jade the way they look at society
100%.
and looks at life. And the second thing was the 1968 convention was called a police riot. So just a jade idea I'd like you to speak to.
Yeah, so we can, I guess, so I'll take I 100% agree. Being a police officer affects your outlook. That's really what my book's about, right? Like how this job shapes and changes you. My brother, after 27 years in the police department, 27 and a half years, retired. He has 40 acres in Wyoming. If my brother was a plumber, he would not have 40 acres in Wyoming, right? If my brother was a teacher, he would not have 40 acres in Wyoming, you know? So it makes you're being lied to a lot. So you start to think everyone's full of it, you know? And I think that's a sad way to live sometimes. I really believe this. I think being a police officer in Chicago, or name it, I think it takes a piece of your soul. In Chicago, I think in some major markets, I think it'd take a chunk. But I think that's a hell of a price to pay for a civil service job. And I don't think officers get in the job knowing that's going to be the case. But I don't think they know, hey, when I sign up for this job, I'm given a piece of my soul. But I believe they are. Now, 68, a police riot, we can call whatever we want. Like there's certainly arguments to be made for that. Can I tell you a fascinating stat, though? And I'm not a defender of the police department in Chicago or elsewhere, right? In this book, I never use the word heroes. Like I understand police officers have sins. And they got to account for those, okay? I get that. It's a very conscious decision by me in this book not to use the word heroes because my father was a corrupt cop. Okay, I get it. One of the fascinating things I uncovered about the 68 convention, do you know how many people were killed at the 68 convention? 0. Do you know how many were killed by police at the Republican National Convention in Miami in 1968? Not 0. Not 0. Okay. So it's a very interesting how perspective of Chicago. Now, John O'Shea will tell you at 68, he walked into a diner in full uniform on kind of a break, and the diner stood up and rose for him and his other officers as they walked in to have a meal and started clapping for him. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but that was something John experienced, right? It's fascinating to hear the different perspectives on 1968 because people have wildly different perceptions of what happened there. But I actually think in some ways, the police showed a tremendous amount of restraint in some respects. But I think you can make an argument against that as well, right? Like that was some nasty footage that was being viewed to the world. We're in the early days of television, some nasty things being viewed to the world too. It didn't look good. Daley did give him free reign. Yeah. So you're right.
Yes. I'm going to make a comment. I reviewed as a clinical social worker working for the military. I reviewed all the police blotters of domestic incidents over 20 years, which became very difficult. I would assign clinical social workers to go with our military police officers to homes and families. I was the guy who decided to take children away from their parents because of child abuse, sexual abuse, all that kind of stuff. The trauma that the police officers had was exponential in terms of dealing with trauma, and the suicide attempts or ideation of those police officers was over the roof in terms of potential. It is traumatizing to the police officers and what they have to do. And now police officer and social work response coordination is really trying to take an impact in our suburbs. I don't know how it's happening in the city, but I know my village, Skokie, as a family service commissioner, we've developed a program for social work and police officers to go to all domestic calls, which is happening in many of our communities throughout the, at least the northern suburbs. This is helping to reduce the trauma of the police officers having to have all the total responsibility of dealing with those cases of trauma that they're responding to. It's still going on, what you're talking about. The trauma, the secondary trauma for the police officer is just over the roof. And we need to be taking more action to help our police officers deal with the trauma that they're having to respond to.
I'd agree. And that kind of answers, I think, a little bit of your question. You're starting to see some structural changes about how things are, how I should say leadership is trying to support officers. So yes. There's some differences, right? Yeah, it's more of a comment. Well, we're almost wrapping up because I'm sorry. So
Can we go to the chat question?
We have, I think,
David?
one more question, and then I'm going to wrap it up and put a bow on
Okay.
it. So yes, sir.
I grew up in the city.
Yes.
I haven't lived in the city for quite some time, but I grew up in the 50s in Rogers Park. we were on a first name basis with most of the police in the precinct there. We used to play them in softball every spring. There was a strong bond of community between the residents and the police. Even to the point where we would get run into the station every once in a while, you know, and you'd be in the interrogation room and the captain would walk in and say, "Bob, what are you doing here?" That was a reminder to us just to stay straight. Nothing ever happened. We
Yeah.
were never charged with anything. Is there anything like that now to trying to restore community relations between the residents and the police? And is it possible?
So nothing formal. I think officers who can leverage personal relationships do that all the time,
Right.
you know, but
I mean, like-
as you did,
Yeah.
or as you would have experienced as a kid, but I don't think there's anything necessarily formal. I think they try to cultivate some
Well,
of
they
that.
did that off.
Think about, if any of you grew up in Chicago, how many of you had a beat cop who walked? Anyone? Once in a while, you know, cops would get out and walk
remember
a
that,
beat.
but what
That
about-
doesn't really exist anymore.
there was
But that's a
that-
great way to know your neighbors, right?
That was their officer friendly program too.
Correct. There's still things like that, especially in suburban communities. In Chicago, those exist where there's community kind of service officers, like an assigned
Right.
to a district. So some of those things exist. How well the programs are executed is a different thing versus theory versus execution. If I could just point out something that's really interesting to me that I think this crowd might appreciate is in this book, I profile, I think the turning point, there's an interesting turning point in when I think the experience in terms of public perception of police from what you would have experienced in the 1950s, like I knew them by their first name.
Right.
Right.
And they
And
knew
they
you.
were largely viewed as friends. I think the first crack in that armor, and this is my argument, and I think supports it, is the Summerdale scandal.
Yes.
Because if you remember the Summerdale scandal in 1958, I believe, the Summerdale scandal was police officers stealing from businesses their squad cars
And from homes.
and from homes using their squad cars. Like that went from being like, oh, these are our friends, these are the good guys, to like, what are these jerks doing?
They were using the police watch
Yeah.
list.
So
People
not
on
a good look.
vacation. Right.
And I think that was kind of the first
Good point.
chink in the armor of the public starting to, because, you know, I think for somebody who grew up in Chicago, if you got pulled over in the 50s, it was kind of like known you'd give $5 or something and
Yeah.
like right or wrong, but you kind of knew, well, this is the game we're all
It was
playing
the
here.
system.
That's very different than using a squad car to steal.
Well, yeah, well, the
And-
Summerdale thing spawned a joke that was like, someone called the Somerville police station and said, my house has been robbed. And they said, we know.
Yeah. So, so Summerdale, I think is a big thing. I'm going to wrap up here, folks, very quick, just 2 minutes. Oh, I don't have my slide anymore.
I have a quick question.
Oh, okay.
What was the reaction of the police who read your book? And did you draw any conclusions? Or was your purpose just to profile some officers?
All right. So as to reaction, I'd say, you know, I'm blessed. When you put out a book for public consumption, this is the true of any author. You put out something for public consumption, you're going to get people who love it and people who disagree with it at points. I'm okay with either side. And I've heard both from police, you know, oh, there was too much of this or not enough of that. All I know is I could look myself in the mirror and I did the most diligent job I could do. Your second part of your question, sir? Oh, draw any conclusions. Or kind of what my purpose was, right? What my purpose was. I'm not here to bang anyone over the head and say that the Chicago Police Department's the greatest, you know, organization in the world, because they're not. They make a lot of missteps, and that includes leadership down to individual officers. I do think it's important, and if I had one word of purpose for this book for me, it was empathy. Let's understand what it's like these officers confront. Like when you see the 11th district and see what they have to go up against, I hope that makes you say, wow, that's a pretty tough job. Like this isn't just sitting there eating donuts and drinking coffee. Like, and so I hope by reading some of the stories, by getting some of the background and understanding what Chicago police officers are up against and how the department is organized and structured, I hope it inspires a degree of empathy for the world they work on. That does not mean they're perfect. That does not mean they were without sin. That does not mean they should be held accountable. But I do hope it inspires some degree of empathy. And I think empathy is a big thing that's missing in this world, in my generation, really lacks it.
Hey,
we're-
Dan, we had 40 on, hey, Dan, we had 40 on chat. Can we take one question from chat?
Sure, I guess.
All right. First of all, my brother is David Rossi, and he solved one huge problem every week on Criminal Minds. So this
Oh.
leads to the question, and that's true. But what he hasn't solved one since there's a writer's strike. What's the biggest misunderstanding we have about a cop's job?
Ooh. So I titled this program Where TV Cop Shows Fail. It's a good question. And I think one of the misconceptions we have is that police go to a scene, right? Like we watch television and we think like the police knock on the door where the criminal's supposed to live and he's there. And then we get DNA processed immediately. Like it does not work that efficiently, right? And so I think we have this conception sometimes from like pop culture that these things are solved in neat 44-minute windows, and they're not. They're very complex and very layered and very time consuming, and they drag and they drag and they drag, even the most straightforward cases. So I think that's probably the biggest misconception.
Thank you.
Yes, so I'll end it there. So is that okay? Yes, and if any of you would like a copy of the book, I have them over here. I'd be glad to sign one for you. So thank you, folks, all of you. Thank you.